Hi, everyone. This lecture is called Seeing Land, Objectivity and Subjectivity, where we are connecting our reading from Liz Wells to the New Topographics, A Man-Altered Landscape from the 1970s. When we photograph the land, we're not just recording what it looks like, we're shaping how it's understood. With Liz Wells' introduction to Land Matters, Landscape Photography, Culture, and Identity, she reminds us that photography transforms space into place through representation. Every visual choice, from framing to color, participates in constructing its meaning. We're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about this historically and aesthetically, and how throughout the history of landscape photography, there has been a tension between objectivity and subjectivity. Liz Wells, Landscape as Cultural Text, where she says space is rendered into place through representation, meaning that the land isn't neutral. It's layered with history, culture, and ideology. The photographer just doesn't document it, they interpret it. Landscape photography always contains both objectivity and subjectivity. Even a straightforward image is guided by a perspective. How we choose to look determines what the land becomes. This photograph here is by David Hilliard, who creates large-scale, multi-paneled color photographs. And his work is often based on his life or the lives of people around him. His panoramas direct the viewer's gaze across the image surface, allowing narrative, time, and space to unfold. This work, Final Destination, is from his Out West series, and his whole body of work is talking about his life out in Colorado, because much of his personal life and professional life, he is often taken to places that are unknown. He photographs with a 4x5 view camera, and it's not only just of landscapes, but it is also of people, both known and unknown. So with here in this panorama, we see how in the middle panel, we have a moving truck with a big wrap of a landscape on it, indicating traveling to new and exciting places. And it is sitting right in the middle of the actual landscape that is continuing from the edges of the truck. So it's like we want to go into nature and to see the undisturbed land, but our physical presence, the actual act of moving, is disrupting that experience. So let's just review objectivity and subjectivity in photography. Objectivity is when we have photographs that have a lot of clarity, they're very neutral, they act as evidence, photography as fact, where subjectivity values expression, emotion, and interpretation, talking about photography as feeling, where the photographer is inserting themselves into the work. And then when we think about landscape, landscape often blends both of these objectivity and subjectivity ideas. They coexist with each other, which, as we have moved throughout this semester, we see how photographs can go back and forth between objective and subjective just based off of our personal experiences. So, the new topographics in Mayan Altered Landscape, the exhibition from 1975. Some of the big name photographers, we have Robert Adams, Louis Boltz, and Joel Deal. And this exhibition was a big landmark in the history of photography because it changed the way that we see the land. Instead of romantic views, photographers presented suburban sprawl and industrial sites. Their approach was cool, detached, and documentary, resisting emotions. William Jenkins described the work as stylistically anonymous, but that neutrality became its own aesthetic, revealing human impact and cultural disconnection. So here with Louis Baltz's photograph, he has this whole industrial parks series, and it's very interesting thinking about industrial parks because they tend to be off of huge major roads, and it is just a bunch of very uniform, stale, big buildings that are just one right after another. And they are large structures. And so it's interesting to see in this photograph that we have a small little patch of dirt. And the scale of it in comparison to the rest of the environment is just showing how much we have taken over and what little is left there. Usually when we see these kind of isolated uh, moments within pavement, there is usually some sort of indication of nature, like a tree being within it. Here, it looks as though whatever natural element has been removed. And so going back to the anonymous feeling here of not knowing what was actually within this space here and just seeing its remains. When we think about the aesthetics of neutrality when it comes to color, this is where we start to get a lot of muted palettes, and then working with even light. We typically want to avoid dramatic skies, so thinking about those overcast days, so that way we can further enforce this idea of detachment and observation. Um, and then it also kind of gives us a sense of melancholy as well. And so with that, we're getting emotion through the absence of color drama, like we've learned before with the different ways we can achieve color contrast that can make our images really active. And so this aligns with Wells' argument that the illusion of objectivity always carries emotional residue. Photographers, after the new topographics, expanded their emotions through the use of color. And so we just saw Stephen Shore's work, but it was very banal. right? Overcast day. The streets were even empty. There wasn't much of a narrative going on here. But within these next few photographers, we are going to be talking more about the emotional landscape because color is what bridges the factual and emotional, where this goes back to what Wells calls the politics of perception. So here is Joel Sternfeld. He is an artist, photographer whose work is concerned with utopic and dystopic possibilities of the American experience. A little bit more about him. Ever since the publication of his landmark study, American Prospects, in 1987, his work has maintained conceptual and political aspects while also being steeped in history, art history, landscape theory, and attention to seasonal passage. It's a melancholic, spectacular, funny, and profound portrait of America. And so within this particular piece here, McLean, Virginia, December 1978, we, first of all, thinking about the color palette, it has this sort of warm pink, purple cast almost over everything. And when we think about those colors, we don't necessarily get sad about them, right? It's just like a nice, warm, kind of fun feeling here. And as we look in the between our focal planes, the foreground and the middle ground, we are seeing this fresh market and all of these pumpkins. In the foreground, they are all stomped or just taken apart by animals, whatever. But then in the middle, we have these pristine pumpkins, and we can see one person who is looking at them and trying to evaluate which pumpkin to buy. But then in the background, we have this huge catastrophic event of a house literally burning down. So the contrast between emotions here, thinking about the everyday banality of just buying um, some food, some produce, pumpkin here, with a house where someone is potentially losing everything that they own. And they could even be um, in there and possibly getting hurt. So this kind of brings attention to awareness and bearing witness to events. And the only person we see within this photograph is very much self-absorbed here. The next photographer about emotional landscapes is Richard Misrach. He is an American photographer. He has photographed the deserts of the American West and has pursued projects that document the changes in the natural environment that have been wrought by various man-made factors. He is one of the most influential photographers of his generation, and he is a big influence with the renaissance of color photography. Um, Here with this photograph, it it's a chapter from his Desert Cantos series, which explores the Southwest American landscape. Um, and so early sections of this work focus on elemental forces, including the flood, focused on the Salton Sea and fires, chronicling the burning desert. Other chapters include clouds, non-equivalent, and heavenly bodies that explore the desert's natural and man-made phenomena in abstract ways, turning toward the emotional resonance of the natural world. This particular photograph is from the border Cantos section of Desert Cantos. And it is made in collaboration with the experimental um, composer Guillermo Galindo. And they explore the unseen realities of the US and Mexico borderlands. And so, what's really interesting about this image is it's a beautiful landscape where we have these nice fluffy clouds in the background and that have like a nice gentle blue with it. And then we kind of see this, not necessarily rolling hills, but this nice cascading effect of the greenery and the rocks that are heading towards the ridge in the center of the photograph. And then we have this very elegant line coming from the bottom left-hand corner and sweeping towards the center of the background of our photograph. And the perspective in which this is being taken from, we don't necessarily understand that it's a wall unless if we look at the caption. If the caption wasn't there, it would be really hard to understand what it actually is. And as it is moving throughout the focal planes, so it is receding through space and therefore receding in size. So between the movement and the perspective of this line, we actually don't get the grand scale of what this wall actually is. And even with seeing the title wall, it's still pretty, there's a lot of, it doesn't give too much context for it there. But it's such a beautiful photograph because we have the reddish, rust reddish of the wall with the green and the blue, those all being um, separated by the neutrals of the grays. It is a very pleasing photograph to look at, but this is actually showing the divide between two nations and us trying to keep the other out. So again, a tension between those feelings there. So the objective just showing the space as it is, and us thinking that this photograph is very beautiful because there isn't much of a narrative going on unless if you start looking more into the context of the work, which then becomes subjective because now we're understanding how political of a structure this is within the landscape. And then the last photographer, um, when it comes to talking about emotional landscape, is Joshua Rashad McFadden. He is a visual artist and the assistant professor of photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And he uses portraiture, he uses archival imagery to explore the themes and concepts related to identity, masculinity, history, race, and sexuality. His practice provides a frame of reference that articulates the many personalities of Black men. And so, with this image right here and blood at the root, it is from his series A Lynching's Long Shadow. And it meditates on the connection between the wooded outdoors and the gruesome histories of lynching. And so, what's happening here is we are going back to an actual site where a lynching occurred. And so, McFadden, he was working with the descendants of this gentleman named Elwood Higginbotham, who was a 29-year-old tenant farmer who was killed by a flash mob over a dispute with a white landholder. And this whole series is about the site of his murder in Oxford, Mississippi. And so it's not meant to avoid the beauty of the southern woods, but this whole series is a little bit haunting here. Because when we look at this particular photograph, we are at ground level and we see this nice highly saturated moss green in the foreground. We start to see the textures of all of these dead leaves in the middle ground. And then we see this very small stump that is relatively in the center of the photograph. When looking at it, it just looks like a stump, but actually with this, it is a marker. And this is happening throughout all of the woods in this particular area where whenever someone was lynched, they put a stump or a rock at the actual site in which someone was murdered. So learning more about the history of the land here, it's not just an interesting point of view um, of the woods. It is carrying a lot of emotional weight because you are literally standing on a grave. And if you didn't know the backstory behind it, you just would have been walking all over this person, these terrible events, not bearing witness again. So it's almost as if history is repeating itself here. So now the emotional spectrum of objectivity. We see that Liz Wells has taught us that landscape photography is both evidence and emotion, whereas the new topographics reframed objectivity as critique. And so when we start photographing landscapes, all of our technical decisions carry a meaning. So photography just doesn't show the land, it teaches us how to see it. And so, with these technical decisions, we have to think about our message behind it and therefore how to turn a space that we do not know into a place where we can start talking about its history and develop a stronger connection to it.